She was already looking at me when I walked through the door, and it was not the kind of look that made you feel welcome. It was the kind of look a person gives a stray animal that has somehow found its way into a formal dining room. Curious, slightly amused, and already planning how to remove it. I had been warned about Princess Sarevith of the Allurian First House. My briefing documents described her as diplomatically challenging. My actual source, a retired Earth contact officer named Owen Barrett who had spent 3 years in the outer transit corridors, described her in far simpler terms. She is not mean, Owen had told me over coffee the night before I shipped out. Mean is when you enjoy hurting people. She does not enjoy it. She simply does not notice it. That is worse. He was right. I noticed that immediately. The convocation hall of the Allurian sovereignty was not a building. It was a statement. Everything about it said the same thing in 100 different ways. The columns were carved from a mineral that did not exist on Earth, translucent and pale gold, each one rising nearly 60 meters before meeting a ceiling made entirely of reinforced observation glass. Through that ceiling, you could see the stars. Not a projection, not a screen. The actual stars, sharp and cold and infinite, hanging above every conversation, every treaty, every ceremony that had ever taken place in this room. It was designed to humble you. I had read about it, knowing the trick did not make it stop working. The hall was already full when my delegation arrived. I say delegation, but what I mean is 3 people. Me, Dr. Priya Nair, our xenolinguist who had spent 11 years learning Galactic Common and still got nervous when she had to speak it in front of native speakers. And Owen, who technically held the title of cultural liaison but whose actual job was to stand next to me and tell me quietly when I was about to do something that would accidentally start a crisis. 3 people. The Saloon delegation had 240 members. The Vreth came with nearly 300, arranged in precise geometric formation, their compound eyes moving constantly, cataloging everything. The Allurian host party alone numbered in the thousands, every one of them dressed in layered ceremonial cloth that shifted color depending on the angle of the light. I watched Priya's face as we entered. She had spent over a decade preparing for this moment, and she still went quiet for a full 30 seconds, just taking it in. I understood. I had done the same thing the first time I saw deep space from an open viewport. Some things earn the silence they demand. Owen leaned close to me. We are the smallest delegation here by a significant margin. I noticed, I said. Several of the other representatives are looking at us. I noticed that too. They look amused. Let them. The reception before the formal ceremony was held in an adjacent chamber, slightly smaller but no less impressive. Food and drink had been arranged for every biological requirement of every attending species, a logistical achievement I genuinely admired. I had a cup of something warm that tasted almost like coffee and was probably nothing like it, and I stood near the far wall and watched the room. I was good at watching rooms. 31 years of military service had made me good at it. You learn to read the shape of a space, where the power is, where the tension is, who is performing confidence and who actually has it. The Saloon ambassador, an ancient creature with gray-green skin and slow, deliberate movements, was speaking with the Kaldri representative, who had no fixed form and communicated through color shifts in its gaseous body. They had both been spacefaring civilizations for more than 4,000 years. They had the ease of long acquaintance. The Vreth delegation stood in their formation and spoke to no one outside it. Not from rudeness, I had read. From habit. They processed information best when isolated from social noise. And then there was Sarevith. She moved through the room the way very beautiful and very powerful people sometimes do, as though the space between her and the next conversation was a stage, and every step was a deliberate choice. She was tall, like all Illurians. Her skin was pale with that iridescent quality her species carried, a faint shimmer at the cheekbones and the edges of her jaw, like light bending around her. Her eyes were a deep amber, and they were already pointed at me before she reached me. She stopped in front of our small group. Her two attendants stopped precisely one step behind her. She looked at me for a moment, then at Priya, then at Owen, and then back at me. "The Earth delegation," she said. Her galactic common was perfect, with a rhythm that made the language sound musical. "I am told there are only 3 of you." "There are only 3 of us," I said. "That is a very small number for an occasion of this significance." "We did not want to take up more space than necessary," I said. "Politeness." Something in her expression shifted barely, the way a door shifts when someone behind it moves closer. "You are the envoy, Elias Voss." "I am." She tilted her head slightly. "Your species has only been registered in the outer transit corridors for 62 years. This is your first formal appearance at a convocation." "It is," I said. "You must be very excited," she said. The word excited carried something inside it. Not quite mockery, just distance. The distance between someone watching a child take its first steps and someone who learned to walk so long ago they have forgotten the effort. Owen shifted almost imperceptibly beside me. Warning movement. I kept my face neutral. "We are honored to be here." She studied me for another moment, the way you study something you are trying to categorize. Then she said, in a tone that was entirely conversational and entirely intentional, "Tell me, envoy, your species is young, newly arrived, promising, many say, in the way that new things can be promising before they show their limits." She paused. "Does your civilization even have a history worth presenting at a convocation such as this? Or is Earth's story still too short to fill the room?" The attendants behind her did not react. They had heard this voice before. They knew what it was. I looked at her for a moment, not a long moment, just enough. "We have history," I said, "perhaps too much of it." She smiled precisely, the smile of someone who has been given exactly what they expected. "How interesting," she said, and moved on to the next conversation. Owen exhaled slowly next to me. Priya touched my arm once lightly. I took another sip of the not-quite coffee and watched Saravith cross the room toward the saloon ambassador, already performing warmth for him that she had not bothered performing for me. I was not offended. I had been underestimated before, by people who had far more reason to know better. The chime sounded 3 times, long and resonant, filling every corner of the hall. The formal ceremony was beginning. As we moved with the assembled crowd back into the main chamber, back under that ceiling of real stars, Priya walked beside me and said quietly, "She was not kind." "No," I agreed. "Are you all right?" I looked up at the stars for a moment, cold and sharp and infinite. "Ask me again in an hour," I said. The moderator took the podium. The ceremony had a name in galactic common that translated roughly as the accounting of ages. Every attending civilization would step forward and present a single number from their recorded history. The number of wars they had fought. It was a tradition, a way of measuring how far a civilization had come. The lower the number, the closer to true enlightenment you were considered. The convocation treated it almost like a prayer. I sat down between Owen and Priya and looked at the podium and thought about the number I was going to say. I had known it for weeks. I had calculated it carefully, cross-referenced every historical record, argued with 4 different historians back on Earth about the exact definition of what qualified. We had landed on the conservative figure. 99. I let the opening words of the moderator wash over me and folded my hands in my lap and waited. The moderator was a tall Illyrian with silver markings along the sides of his throat, which indicated senior rank in their ceremonial hierarchy. His name was something long and multisyllabic that translated into galactic common as something like "he who holds the record." He had been the presiding officer of the last 4 convocations, which meant he had been doing this job for over 400 years. He spoke with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to rush. Every word landed exactly where it was aimed. He explained the tradition to the chamber, though everyone in it knew the tradition well. It was for the record. Everything at a convocation was for the record. The accounting of ages, he explained, was not a competition. It was a reflection, a moment for each civilization to look back at the long road that brought them here and acknowledge that the road had not always been smooth, that some paths had gone through fire before they reached the stars. I noticed that several delegations nodded solemnly at this, very moving, very dignified. I looked at my hands. The Kaldri went first. They always went first by tradition, because they were the oldest registered civilization in the sovereignty, having achieved spaceflight approximately 11,000 years ago. Their representative had no physical body in the traditional sense, just a slowly shifting cloud of deep violet gas inside a transparent housing unit, roughly humanoid in shape. A translator device spoke for them. The voice it produced was calm and even. The Kaldri Collective has engaged in 0 recorded wars. The room responded immediately. Not polite applause, something deeper, a sound of genuine admiration. Several delegates rose to their feet. The moderator bowed his head briefly toward the Kaldri representative, a significant gesture in Illyrian protocol. Even Sarevith, seated in the elevated diplomatic gallery to my left, pressed her hands together in the formal gesture of respect. 0, the number everyone was reaching for, the number that said we have never needed to destroy each other. I watched this and felt something I could not quite name, not envy, something older, something that knew what the Kaldri did not know, which was that there are things you only learn from fire. The Saloon were next. Their ancient ambassador stepped forward with slow dignity. He placed one broad hand on the podium and said simply, 1. Another round of admiration, warm, genuine, respectful. One conflict over 3,000 years ago, settled, mourned, never repeated. The Saloon had a monument to that single event on their home world, not a monument to victory, a monument to the fact that it had happened at all, a reminder carved in stone. That, the moderator noted for the record, was wisdom. The Vreth presented next, their lead strategist moving forward with crisp, mechanical precision. 2 recorded conflicts. The last concluded 1,400 years ago. More applause. The Vreth strategist returned to formation without acknowledging it. That was very Vreth. One after another, the civilization stepped forward. 3, 5, 4, 7. Each number received its response, calibrated by the audience based on the size and age of the civilization presenting. A younger species presenting 5 was treated differently than an ancient one presenting the same. Context was applied. Generosity was extended. But the direction was always the same. Lower was better. Higher meant you had further to go. A civilization called the Murath, small and bird-like, presented 11. There was a visible pause in the room before the polite response came. The Murath representative looked down at the podium for a moment before returning to their seat. Priya leaned close to me. 11 made them uncomfortable, she whispered. I noticed, I said. She did not say what we were both thinking. I had spent the last 30 minutes calculating the math, because that is what you do when you have been a soldier. You count things, you measure threats, you prepare. The highest number presented so far was 11, and the room had gone slightly cold at 11. I was carrying 99. Owen on my other side was very still. He had been still for about 20 minutes. That was his version of loud. The presentations continued. 9, 6, 3. Another 0 from a very small, very ancient species of bioluminescent creatures from the Andir cluster. More applause for the 0. I watched Sarevith in the gallery. She was watching the ceremony with the ease of someone who had seen it many times, but her eyes drifted to our delegation periodically. Not with malice, with something closer to casual curiosity. The way you check on a jar you have set on a high shelf, just to confirm it has not moved. Then I saw her lean toward the attendant on her left and speak briefly. The attendant nodded, moved quietly along the gallery, and descended to the main floor where the moderator stood. I watched the attendant reach the moderator, watched them exchange a few words, watched the moderator glance briefly in our direction, then nod once. Owen saw it too. He did not look at me. He just said, quietly and without moving his mouth very much, "That was not good." I agreed, but I did not say so. 2 more civilizations presented. 14. 8. Then the moderator looked up from his notes and spoke. "We will now hear from the delegation of Earth, the human sovereignty, the Sol system." The room shifted, not dramatically, just the way a large body of water shifts when something beneath the surface moves. A ripple of attention, heads turning, the quiet recalibration of focus. Several delegates had clearly expected us to be called much later. I heard someone in a nearby section say something in a language my translation device rendered as, roughly, the primitives already. It was not whispered as carefully as the speaker probably thought. Priya's hand tightened on her data pad. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket, which was a habit from a long time ago that I had never lost. I walked down the aisle between the seating sections, across the open floor, and up to the podium. My footsteps were quiet on the stone floor, but the room was so silent that I heard them anyway. I placed my hands on the podium and looked out at the hall. 41 civilizations, thousands of eyes in every shape and color that biology had invented, the ceiling of stars above everything, the gold columns on every side. I looked up at the diplomatic gallery. Saravith was watching me with both hands resting lightly in her lap, her expression perfectly neutral. She raised her chin slightly when I met her eyes. It was a small gesture, practically nothing, but it said everything. It said, "Go ahead. Show us what you have. Let us see what the small, young, curious species from the wet blue planet has brought to this magnificent room." I looked back at the hall. I had stood at many podiums. I had delivered reports in the middle of ongoing situations where the wrong word could have shifted everything in the wrong direction. I had given testimony in rooms where powerful people wanted to hear different words than the true ones. I was not afraid of a podium. But I felt something in that moment, not fear, not pride, something more specific than either of those things. I felt the weight of every single person who had ever lived and fought and bled and rebuilt on that small blue planet, pressing against the back of my chest, asking me to carry them correctly. I took a breath, and then Saravith spoke from the gallery, which was not protocol but which no one corrected, because she was who she was and this was her hall. "Before the number," she said, and her voice carried easily, beautifully, like music with an edge in it. "I find myself curious, Envoy. Earth is young. Your recorded history is brief. Your entry into galactic civilization is recent. I imagine your number is quite small." She paused, and several of her attendants smiled in the way that people smile when they are watching someone else's discomfort. "Surely it is nothing to be embarrassed about. Youth is not a flaw. It simply is what it is." The room was paying full attention now. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about Owen's description of her. Not mean, simply does not notice it. I thought about every event I had read in those historical files. Every name, every date, every reason, good and terrible and complicated and human. I thought about my grandfather. I looked back at the room. 99, I said. I said it clearly, not loudly. I did not need to say it loudly. The hall was already completely silent. I said it as a fact, the way a doctor says a diagnosis or the way a navigator reads coordinates. Just a number, just a thing that was true. For a moment, nothing happened. Then everything went very quiet in a new way. Not the polite quiet of ceremony. the deep quiet of a room full of thinking minds all stopping at the same moment. The Vreth strategist's head swiveled toward me with a precise, mechanical motion. The ancient Saloon ambassador's hand rose slowly to rest over his chest. Somewhere in the third row, a translator device began rapidly cycling through clarification protocols, because the number could not possibly have been processed correctly. And in the gallery above, the expression on Princess Sarevith's face changed. It did not collapse. She was too composed for that. But something in it shifted the way stone shifts when weight is placed on a fault line, not breaking, but acknowledging for the first time that it might. I stood at the podium and let the silence do what silence does. I let it sit in the room and grow. 99. The silence lasted for approximately 5 seconds. Then the hall fractured. Not into shouting. Civilizations at this level of development do not simply shout. What happened was something more controlled and more disturbing than shouting. It was the sound of thousands of highly intelligent beings processing information that did not fit into any existing framework, all at the same time. Translation devices were talking over each other. Delegations were turning inward to confer in rapid, low voices. The Vreth strategist had produced a flat data surface from somewhere inside his uniform and was entering information on it with both hands simultaneously. The Murath delegation, who had presented 11 and felt the weight of the room's disapproval, were looking at me with expressions I could not completely read but which contained something that might have been relief. The moderator struck his ceremonial rod against the podium 3 times to call for order. It took longer than it usually did. I stood still. My hands were on the podium. I was watching the room the way I had been trained to watch rooms. I was cataloging the reactions. I was reading the terrain. Sarevith had not moved. When the room settled back into something resembling quiet, she leaned forward slightly in the gallery and said, "Envoy, the moderator requires clarification for the record." Her voice was steady, but it had a new quality, something tighter underneath the surface of it. "Can you confirm the number you stated?" 99, I said. A ripple again, even after they had already heard it once. "You mean," she said, and I could see her reaching for a shape to put around this number that would make it smaller, across your entire recorded history. Across all regional engagements and political disputes of every scale combined into a single cumulative total, including minor incidents. Major recorded conflicts, I said, defined as organized, prolonged force between distinct groups resulting in significant loss of life and territorial or political change. Conservative estimate. There are historians on Earth who would put the number higher. The last part landed the way I meant it to. Sarevith sat back very slightly. The ancient Saloon ambassador rose from his seat. He moved slowly. Everything he did was slow, but there was nothing weak in it. He looked at me across the chamber. "In what span of time?" he asked. 4,000 years of detailed written records, I said. Reliable historical evidence suggests patterns extending several thousand years before that, but we counted only what we could document with confidence. The ambassador stood there for a moment. Then he sat back down in the way that a very old person sits, carefully, as though settling into the weight of a new reality. "That is an extraordinary number," someone said from the left section. "It is a real number," I said. Dr. Priya Nair was sitting in the third row from the left, 4th seat in. I could see her from the podium. She was not looking at her data pad. She was looking at me with an expression that I recognized from the night before we had departed Earth, when we had sat in the departure lounge, and she had asked me what I thought would happen when we said the number aloud in that hall. I had told her I thought the room would go quiet. She had asked how quiet. I had said I did not know exactly, but that I intended to find out. The moderator, to his considerable credit, maintained his composure. He spoke in the formal register reserved for matters of procedural complexity. The delegation of Earth has presented the number 99 as their formal accounting. The record will reflect this number, and the civilization's right to clarify the context of this figure as part of the official presentation. He looked at me. Envoy Voss, you may continue. I had not asked to continue, but I had been given the floor and I did not intend to waste it. I looked at the hall again, at every face and form and eye and translated gaze. I understand what you are feeling right now, I said. You are wondering whether to be afraid of us. No one disagreed. That is a reasonable response, I said. When we were young on Earth, and I mean that in the civilizational sense, we had a version of this moment frequently. A moment when you learn something about another person that does not fit what you assumed about them, and you have to decide what to do with that knowledge. I paused. I am going to tell you about some of those 99 conflicts, not all of them. There is not enough time in this ceremony for all of them, but enough. I began. I did not use notes. I had read every file. I had spent 6 months with those files. Some of them I had lived near enough to touch. I told them about the earliest recorded large-scale conflicts, fought with hand weapons and fire, over land and water and resources. Civilizations at their first steps, terrified and territorial and unable, yet to see past the immediate threat of starvation and displacement. I told them about the conflicts driven by belief. Situations fought because one group understood the universe one way and another group understood it differently, and both groups were so certain of their own understanding that they could not imagine sharing a border with the other. I told them how these lasted generations sometimes, how children were born into them and grew old inside them and never knew a world without them. I told them about the periods of expansion, when humans discovered that other pieces of their own planet existed and decided that they had a right to those pieces. The taking, the enormous, terrible cost of what was taken and from whom, how long the wounds from those events lasted, stretching forward through centuries, still alive in the present day in ways that could not be erased by simply deciding to move on. I told them about the largest conflicts, the ones that swallowed whole continents, that involved nearly every nation on Earth at the time, that introduced new categories of destruction so complete and so efficient that humanity was forced to sit down afterward and invent new legal frameworks simply to describe what had happened and make sure it never happened again. The room was very still. I had expected revulsion. I was getting something more complicated. The Vreth strategist had stopped entering data. He was simply watching me. The Murath delegation were leaning forward. Even the Kaldri's gaseous form had shifted slightly, its color deepening, which I had read somewhere indicated focused attention. But in several sections, I could see the other reaction too, the pulling back, the distance. A Saloon Junior delegate had turned slightly away, her face angled toward the floor. 2 members of a species I did not know by name were exchanging quiet words in a way that felt like distress. And in the gallery, Sarevith was perfectly still, both hands in her lap, looking at me with an expression I could not fully categorize because it was not the expression I had expected. She was not looking at me with contempt. She was looking at me the way you look at something when you are trying very hard to understand it, and the understanding keeps almost arriving but not quite. I kept going. We fought over languages, I said. We fought over the placement of borders drawn by rulers who had never visited the land in question. We fought over written documents, over who had the right to interpret them and who did not. We fought over ships in neutral waters. We fought because of the assassination of one man, and that single event pulled most of the planet into a conflict that took millions of lives before it was finished. I let that sit. One man, I said again more quietly. The Saloon ambassador made a low sound. His species used sound the way humans used facial expressions. We fought at one point over a bucket, I said. The universal translation made this land exactly as strange as it sounded. Someone in the hall said something in their own language that their translation device rendered as, roughly. I do not think that was correctly translated. It was correctly translated, I said. We have a name for it. We call it the War of the Bucket. It lasted approximately 2 years, thousands of lives. One bucket, this is not metaphor, this is documentation. A new kind of silence settled in. Not the silence of shock, the silence of something clicking into place. Because that was the thing about 99. It was not just a large number, it was a specific kind of large number. It was a number that told you something true about what kind of creature you were dealing with. Humans had not gone through those 99 conflicts despite being intelligent, feeling creatures capable of love and reason and extraordinary creativity. They had gone through them because of it, because they cared so deeply and so fiercely about the things they believed, and the people they loved and the land they stood on that they had repeatedly, throughout their entire history, decided that the worst possible outcome was worth risking rather than surrendering the thing they were protecting. I had not said that yet, I was building toward it. But I could see in the room that some of them were beginning to feel the shape of it. Not all of them, some were still sitting in the revulsion. That was honest and I did not blame them for it. But enough. Priya in the third row had tears on her face, not from sadness. I knew what those tears were. I had felt them myself, the first time I had really sat with the full scope of what humans had done to each other and what they had somehow survived anyway. I looked at the hall. I said, "You are thinking, this species should not be here. That giving them a place in this sovereignty is like handing sharp tools to someone who has never learned to be careful." I looked directly at the gallery. "You are wondering how we survived." I looked back at the hall. "That," I said, "is exactly the right question." I had 20 seconds of silence after that last line, and I used all of them. Not for drama. Soldiers do not manufacture drama. Drama gets people hurt. I used the silence because what I was about to say was important enough to deserve its own moment of stillness, the way a heavy door deserves to be opened slowly. "Let me tell you what 99 conflicts did to us," I said. "The first thing they did was hurt. I do not mean that lightly or metaphorically. I mean that the accumulated loss of every event over 4,000 years produced a kind of collective injury in the human species that has never fully healed and probably never will. Every generation carried the weight of what the previous generation had endured. Children grew up in cities that were still being rebuilt. Grandparents described things to grandchildren that no description could do justice to. There is a kind of knowledge that only comes from loss that close, and humans carry it in their bones." I let that land. The second thing those conflicts did was force us to become very good at certain things that peaceful civilizations never needed to learn. I paused. When you have a serious wound, you do not have time to study medicine at a comfortable pace. You figure out what works because the alternative is losing the patient. During the largest human conflicts of the past 2 centuries, the pressure of wartime medical need drove advances in the treatment of infection, trauma, and disease that would have taken decades longer under normal conditions. The treatments that now save millions of lives every year on Earth were developed faster because we were desperate, and desperation is a remarkable teacher when nothing else will do. I could see the Vreth strategist was writing again. Communication technology, the network of connected devices that now spans our entire planet, that allows a person in one city to speak to a person on the other side of the world instantly, that forms the backbone of everything we call modern civilization. That technology was originally developed by a military research program, not because anyone planned for it to become what it became, but because urgent need created the invention. I looked across the hall. "Flight. Your records note that humans achieved powered atmospheric flight approximately 120 years ago. Within 4 decades of that achievement, We were sending objects into orbit. Within 60 years, we had landed on our own moon. That trajectory, that acceleration, happened because competing nations kept funding the next step and the step after that, faster than any single peaceful program would have been funded. The saloon ambassador was listening, with the intense stillness of someone who is recalibrating something important. "I'm not saying that conflict is good," I said clearly. "I want that on the record in simple terms. It is the most expensive thing a civilization can choose. The cost is always higher than the ledger shows, because the ledger cannot fully count what a person who was lost might have become, what they might have built, who they might have loved. That cost is real and it is permanent. I know this from my own life in ways I do not need to detail." The hall was completely quiet. "What I am saying is something different. I am saying that the pressure of those 99 events forced humanity to solve problems it would not have solved otherwise, on timelines it would never have met otherwise. And those solutions did not stay locked away. They spread. They moved. They became the world." I turned slightly, addressing the full width of the chamber. "Consider what it means to negotiate under genuine pressure. Not the comfortable pressure of a disagreement between stable civilizations with no existential stakes. The kind of pressure where the agreement you reach in the next 4 hours determines whether millions of people live or endure. Where the person across the table from you is someone you have been fighting, whose losses mirror your own, who has every reason to distrust you, and whom you have every reason to distrust in return. And you still have to find the words. You still have to find the terms, because the alternative is something neither of you can afford." A pause. "Humans have done that many times. We have sat across from former enemies and built peace out of the wreckage of the worst thing two groups of people can do to each other. We know how to do that. We know it in a way that you do not learn from theory. We know it because we had to." I looked at the Kaldri representative, the gentle, ancient, perfectly peaceful collective that had never known conflict. "Your species has never been through this," I said. "That is a great and genuine achievement. I mean that without any irony. But it also means that your civilization has never had to rebuild from total collapse. You have never had to create a new form of government from the ruins of a failed one, never had to design a legal framework capable of preventing what just destroyed everything you had built. Never had to look at your greatest failure and turn it into architecture for something better." I let that sit. Every major political institution Earth has today was built in direct response to a catastrophe. The frameworks we use to protect individual rights, to govern the conduct of conflict, to coordinate international response to shared threats, were all built in the aftermath of things going terribly wrong. We did not build them from philosophy. We built them from the specific, documented knowledge of what happens when they do not exist. From the gallery, Saravath's voice came, quiet but clear. She was not challenging this time. She was asking, genuinely asking. "How?" she said. I looked at her. "How does a species survive that many times? What keeps you coming back?" The question surprised me slightly, not because it was not the right question. It was the right question, but the voice asking it was different from the voice that had dismissed me at the reception. The easy certainty was gone. Something real had replaced it. I thought about how to answer her honestly. "We are very bad at stopping," I said. A quiet sound moved through the room, not quite laughter, something adjacent to it. "I mean that seriously. One of the most consistent features of human behavior across all of recorded history is that we do not accept finality well. When something ends, we rebuild it. When we lose, we analyze the loss and make adjustments. When a civilization collapses, someone in the ruins starts making plans, not because of some grand philosophical commitment to survival, because it is simply what we do. We are restless. We are persistent. We are almost constitutionally incapable of accepting that this is the end." I thought about the image of a burned city, with someone already drawing plans in the ash. There is a concept in human engineering called a fail-safe. It is a design principle that says, When something goes wrong, the system should not just stop. It should default to a state that causes the least possible additional damage while preserving the most possible capacity for recovery. I looked at the room. Human civilization, after 99 events, has become something like a biological fail-safe. When we break, we do not break permanently. We break and then we start asking why and what next. And that question, what next, is the most dangerous and most powerful thing in our vocabulary. The Vreth strategist stood. This was, I later learned, extremely unusual. Vreth delegation members did not stand spontaneously during formal proceedings. It was outside their protocol. The strategist stood anyway, looked at me, and said in his translated, precise voice, "You achieved spaceflight while your own planet was divided into active competing entities with no unified command structure." "Correct," I said. "You arrived in this space without first establishing internal peace." "Correct." "You are functionally still arriving," he said. "Not an insult, a statement." "Yes," I said, "we are still becoming, that is exactly right." He sat down. I looked across the hall one more time. "Whatever comes for this part of the galaxy," I said, and I let my voice be quiet, let it be steady, let it carry only what it needed to carry. "Whatever pressure arrives, whatever thing moves through those stars that none of us have names for yet, you will want someone in the room who has already been to the bottom and come back. You will want someone who knows how to rebuild after the worst possible outcome. You will want someone who has practiced, repeatedly, across 4,000 years, the specific skill of standing up after being knocked down and figuring out what to do next." A long pause. "Humanity's 99 conflicts are not our application to join your civilization. They are our record of what we have survived. And the most important word in that sentence is survived." The Saloon ambassador rose first. He rose slowly, the way he did everything, with the weight and deliberateness of great age. He pressed his hands together in the gesture of deep respect. He held it. Then the Vreth delegation stood, all of them simultaneously with their characteristic precision. They did not applaud, they simply stood. The Murath followed, then several others, then more. The moderator did not speak, he did not need to. I stood at the podium and did not smile and did not perform anything. I just stood there and felt the weight of all the names behind me, and I let them have their moment. In the gallery, Sareveth sat very still. She did not stand. She did not bow, but she was looking at me differently now, and the difference was absolute. The easy authority was gone from her face. The casual certainty was gone. What was there instead was something I recognized. It was the look of someone who has just been shown a map of a country they thought they understood, and the map is nothing like what they assumed. I stepped back from the podium. I walked back to my seat. Owen said nothing. He reached over and put his hand briefly on my arm and then took it away. Priya was still crying, quietly, in a way that she would be mildly embarrassed about later, and which I would never mention. I sat down and looked up through the glass ceiling at the stars. Cold and sharp and infinite, and full of things none of us had names for yet. 6 months later, I was packing a travel bag in my quarters aboard the Elurian station when she knocked on the door. I had been expecting the knock for about 3 weeks, which is not to say I was certain it would come. I thought it might. Sareveth was many things, and some of those things had surprised me during the month since the convocation ceremony. But whatever she was not the kind of person who left a question unanswered once it had genuinely taken hold of her. I had seen it happen in the hall. I had watched the question plan itself. I had waited to see if it would grow. It had grown. I said, "Come in," and she did. She was not in ceremonial dress. She was wearing something simpler, still beautiful, still expensive in ways I could not fully assess, but without the layered public armor of the formal version of herself. No attendants, no court, just her, standing in the doorway of my small diplomatic quarters, which were modest by any standard and looked even more modest with her in them. She looked at the bag on the bed, at the small collection of personal items arranged beside it, at the photograph I kept on the desk, which was old and slightly worn at the edges, showing two people who were no longer living. "You are leaving," she said. "The accord is signed," I said. "My work at this particular gathering is finished." She nodded once slowly. She looked at the single chair across from the desk and then looked at me, a question without words. I said, "Please sit." She sat. I sat on the edge of the desk and waited. Sarevith looked at her own hands for a moment, which I had not seen her do before. She was always so controlled in how she presented herself. The glance at her own hands was small and private, a gesture of someone organizing their thoughts before saying something they had not said out loud yet. "The ceremony was 3 days long," she said finally. "After your presentation, there were 18 more civilizations to present. I do not remember any of their numbers." I did not say anything. "I remember the Kaldri, 0. I remember the Saloon, 1. I have known those numbers since I was young. I have known this ceremony since I was a child watching it from the upper gallery." She paused. "And I remember yours." "Most people in that room will remember mine," I said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "My first reaction," she said carefully, "was what you would expect. I thought it was a flaw, a structural problem in your species, the kind of thing that disqualifies a civilization from full standing." "That is a reasonable first reaction," I said. "It was wrong," she said. She said it the way people say things when admitting it costs them something. Directly, without cushioning it, because cushioning it would make the cost smaller, and she was not interested in paying less than what she owed. I studied her for a moment. This was not the same person who had asked me if Earth's story was too short to fill a room. 6 months will do that sometimes, especially 6 months spent sitting with a number like 99. "You spoke about reconstruction," she said, "about building after failure, about knowing things that are only learned through loss." She looked at me directly now. "My civilization has existed for 6,000 years. I said that to you at the reception, and I was using it to indicate superiority." "I understood that," I said. "I understand now that it also means something else." She was quiet for a moment. "There are things we do not know how to do." I looked at her and did not offer her comfort because she was not asking for it. She was asking for honesty, and honesty was something I could give her. "Yes," I said. She absorbed that. "The question I came to ask," she said, "is whether you believe there will be a 100th conflict for your species. Whether, given everything you described, given everything you have survived, you believe humanity is capable of reaching 0. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about answering that question. And then I made a decision that I had been sitting with for 3 weeks, which was how long the debate had been running inside my head about whether this was the right moment, or whether there would ever be a right moment, or whether the right moment had already passed. I stood up from the desk. I walked to the window. My quarters had a small viewport, not the grand ceiling of the convocation hall, just a rectangular frame of reinforced composite material through which you could see a section of open space. I looked at it. Then I said, 3 months before this convocation, Earth's Deep Range Monitoring Network picked up an anomaly near the outer edge of our solar system. Sarevith went still. Something at a distance our network can technically detect but not clearly resolve. Moving, not fast, by galactic travel standards, but steadily, on a heading that, if maintained, would take it through the inner solar system within approximately 14 months. The room was very quiet. We transmitted a greeting signal in every format we have ever used for contact attempts. We received no response. We transmitted again. Nothing. The signal was not jammed. It was simply not answered. I turned around. Sarevith was looking at me with a different kind of stillness than any I had seen from her before. "We did some research," I said, quietly, carefully. "We cross-referenced the sector with every public navigational record available in the Sovereignty archives, which our station liaison team was able to access legally as part of our membership candidacy review. We found something." I paused. Over the past 22 years, 9 separate deep space monitoring probes deployed by various Sovereignty member civilizations in that sector have gone silent. No transmitted distress signals, no degradation warnings, no recoverable wreckage, just silence. Each one attributed to equipment failure or navigation drift into interference zones. Sarevith said nothing. Her hands had tightened slightly in her lap. "We do not have the technology to tell you exactly what is out there," I said. "We are 62 years into spaceflight and our deep range detection is not as sophisticated as yours. But we can tell you that something is there, that it is moving, and that it is not responding to contact." I let that sit in the room for a moment. We did not bring this to the Sovereignty before the convocation for 2 reasons. I kept my voice level and honest. First, because we needed to be members before we raised an alarm. A warning from a non-member civilization carries a different weight than a warning from a full Tier 1 signatory, and we could not afford for this to be treated as the anxious concern of a primitive people misreading their own equipment. We needed standing before we spoke. I paused. Second, because we needed you to know what kind of species was bringing you this warning. We needed you to understand what we are capable of, and what we have survived, before we told you what we are looking at. I looked directly at her. We did not say 99 to shock you or impress you or frighten you. We said 99 so that, when we told you this tonight, you would understand what it means when a species like ours says, "We think something is coming, and we do not know what it is." The silence in the room was different from the silence in the convocation hall. Smaller, more personal, more real. Sarevith stood up, slowly. She walked to the viewport and stood beside me and looked out at the stars. I watched her face. She was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid, but she was facing it, which is a different thing entirely. She was doing what I had watched soldiers and good leaders do, the moment where you stop arguing with the information in front of you and start figuring out what to do with it. "Your people knew this and still came to the convocation," she said. "We came because of it," I said. "We came because if there is something out there, we do not want to face it alone, and we did not want you to face it without us." She was quiet for a long moment. 14 months, she said. "Approximately, the heading could change. We might be reading the movement imprecisely. Our equipment might be introducing errors." I paused. "We might be right." She turned to look at me. "The Sovereignty's deep range array," she said, and her voice was already shifting into the register of someone beginning to plan, "has coverage in that sector. Or it should. The last survey pass was 11 years ago." 11 years is a long time, I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked back out the viewport. "If I convene the Security Council tomorrow morning and present this information, they will ask how it was obtained. They will ask why humanity brought this to a private conversation rather than to the formal record." "Tell them the formal record is where it goes next," I said. "This conversation was not about protocol. It was about making sure that the person who controls the Security Council's agenda understood what she was looking at before she walked into that room." She looked at me. "You planned this conversation," she said. "I planned the possibility of it," I said. "There is a difference." She studied me for a moment with an expression that was new. Not the contempt of the reception, not the recalibration of the convocation hall. Something that was settling into a kind of respect that I recognized because I had seen it form in people before. The specific respect that comes not from admiring someone, but from realizing they are going to be useful in the thing you are about to face. "When I was a child watching the accounting of ages from the upper gallery," she said, My tutor explained to me that the ceremony existed to show civilizations how far they had come, that the point was the distance, that the number getting smaller meant the species was getting better. She paused. I believed that for 6,000 years. It is not a wrong belief, I said. It is just incomplete. What completes it? She asked. The understanding that getting better is not the same as getting safer, I said, and that the things out there in that dark do not grade on the same scale we do. She was quiet. I looked at the section of space I could see through my small viewport. Stars, sharp in particular, each one a sun, each sun its own story, most of those stories still unread. Somewhere out there, in a direction I could almost point to from here, something was moving and not answering. If it comes to a confrontation, Sarevith said, and she chose the word carefully, not using the word I had used throughout my presentation, finding a more neutral one. If what is out there requires a response that this sovereignty has never had to give before. She stopped. Then she began again. Will your people be ready? I had been asked versions of this question before. By generals, by politicians, by frightened people standing at the edge of something they could not see the bottom of. I had a version of an answer that I gave in those moments. An honest one. No one is ever ready, I said. But humanity has had a great deal of practice at not being ready and going forward anyway. She absorbed that in silence. Outside, the stars did not move. They never looked like they moved, even when everything was moving, even when the distances between things were changing in ways that no one yet understood. I will convene the Security Council in the morning, she said. I will present your findings and request a full deep-range survey of the sector using sovereignty-grade equipment. The survey can be completed in 6 weeks if I authorize priority clearance. That would help us considerably, I said. I will request that you and Dr. Nair be present at the briefing. She paused, as Tier 1 signatories. We will be there. She moved toward the door, then she stopped. She did not turn around, she spoke to the door. In 6,000 years, she said, we have never needed to defend this civilization. Everything we have built, every institution and treaty and tradition, was constructed for a world without that need. We are very good at peace, envoy Voss. A pause. We do not know how to be good at anything else. I looked at the back of her head, at the iridescent shimmer along the edge of her jaw that caught even the dim light of my small quarters. Your Highness, I said. She waited. Lucky for you, I said, you just let us in. She was still for one moment. Then she walked out. I stood at the viewport alone and looked at the section of space I could see through my small frame of composite material. The stars did not change. They never did, not on any timescale a human life could measure. They just burned, far away and steady and indifferent. Somewhere in the direction of home, past the orbital paths and the deep dark and the months of travel time, something was moving. I did not know what it was. I did not know what it wanted, or whether wanting was even a concept that applied to it. I did not know whether it had noticed us, whether it understood what a civilization was, whether it recognized the signals we had sent or simply received them as noise. What I knew was something simpler. Humanity had stood at the edge of unknown things before. We had stood at the edge of oceans we could not see across. We had stood at the edge of continents we could not map. We had stood at the edge of our own atmosphere and looked up at the stars with instruments made of metal we had dug out of the ground with our own hands, and we had said, we want to know what is out there. And then we had gone. Every time we had gone somewhere new, something had tried to stop us. Not always an enemy. Sometimes the ocean itself. Sometimes the mountain. Sometimes our own fear, which was in many ways the most formidable obstacle we had ever faced. We had looked at all of it over and over across 4,000 years of documented trying, and we had found ways through. Not clean ways, not cheap ways, not ways that left us unchanged. But through. I finished packing my bag. The photograph was the last thing I packed, the way I always did it, leaving it on the desk until everything else was ready. I stood and looked at it for a moment. Two faces, old light, the particular quality of a picture that has been carried a long time, the softened edges, the slightly faded background. My grandfather had been in one of those 99. My father had been in another. I had been in a third. 3 generations of the same family, each one carrying the weight of the previous one, each one living in a world shaped by what the one before had endured and built and passed forward. That was the thing about history. You did not choose it, you only chose what you did with it. I picked up the photograph carefully and tucked it into the front pocket of the bag. I zipped the bag closed. I turned off the light. In 12 hours, I would be in a Sovereignty Security Council briefing room, sitting next to Priya Nair and across from 41 civilizations that had never needed to prepare for something like this. And I would begin the work of showing them what preparing looked like. In 6 weeks, we would have survey data. In 14 months, give or take, we might have something else entirely. I looked at the viewport one last time, at the stars, at the particular section of dark that I knew, more or less, to be in the right direction. Then I walked out to meet whatever came next.